Let's suppose we're going to do a workshop right here today, building a story world.
Sure.
How would we begin it?
So when we're talking about story worlds, we need to separate stories from story worlds. So story worlds are places, and stories are things that happen in those places. And so what I found, a lot of people, they don't understand what a story world is. Some people say, well, my story world is my character's coming of age sexuality or whatever. That's not a story world. That's like a character arc. A story world literally is a geographical place. We understand the story of Lord of the Rings and Frodo and the Ring and the journey to destroy the ring, but the story world is Middle Earth. So Neo's story is in the Matrix is about his adventure with Morpheus and taking down the Matrix and against the machines and Agent Smith and all that stuff. But the story world of the Matrix is a futuristic Earth that's been taken over by machines, and they use people as batteries in a VR environment. So story worlds are places, and that's what you have to understand. But it's not just any place, it's any place that is interesting. It has to be interesting by itself. And so most people, when they develop content, they develop scripts or TV or features or books, the most interesting things they have are their characters and their plots, and then they relegate story world to setting. As a setting is just simply where my story takes place. But just because you have a setting doesn't necessarily mean you have a story world. A story world is a setting that has independent interest. So it's interest that's independent of any character, independent of any story. So my rule of thumb is, can you take your main character, your protagonist, your hero, can you take them out of the story world and have your story world still be interesting? Right? Can you take the story out of the story world and still have it be interesting? So I can right now take Luke Skywalker out of Star Wars and the Star Wars galaxy, still interesting. I can take Frodo out of Middle Earth is still interesting. I can take Baymax out of Big Hero 6 and San Francisco, still interesting, right? But can you take Rocky out of Rocky? It's a different calculation, right? Because you think, well, they're doing that with Creed. Well, Creed still has Rocky, but I mean, it's if we take Rocky out of Rocky, then we have Philadelphia, which is the setting, but there's nothing independently interesting about Philadelphia. No offense to Philadelphia, right? So, but the interest of Rocky comes through Rocky and Creed and the characters, but the place itself isn't interesting. I mean, you look at something like Gotham with Batman. You can take Batman out of Gotham, and you can have a whole TV show about it, right? Because the place in and of itself is super interesting. And when you have an interesting setting that creates your story world, you now have story potential. And so you will never, any creator, any writer, any director, any filmmaker, they will never truly understand the revenue potential of their brand or their IP unless they actually understand their story world. Story worlds create story potential creates revenue potential. And then revenue potential makes buyers happy. They make the investors happy. They make us happy. The creators happy. They make everybody happy. And so, but if you don't understand your story world, you won't understand that story potential. So story worlds are a really important tool to be able to maximize the story potential in your IP. So you just have to understand first off what a story world is, like what it is at all. Then how do we create it? So a couple easy ways that some easy tips that people can start thinking about as they create story world is they need to be thinking first about their theme, about what they want to say, and about what their perspective is. It goes back to that passion. Like what's the commentary that they're trying to put into any individual story, and then once you understand that, then the starting point for a great story world is a place that needs your soapbox or your theme. So for example, if your theme is all about income inequality, about how the evils of income inequality, and you want to show people that and tell people that equality of income is actually like the ideal for society. Let's say that's what you want to say. The starting place or the starting point for your story world is a place that needs that message, which means that's a place where income inequality is going to be a tremendous problem. That's your starting point. It isn't just like, oh, I'll just set it in Philadelphia, or I'll set it in a fantasy world with wizards. That's not the starting point. The starting point is, what am I trying to say with my movie? What am I trying to say with my book? What am I trying to say with my video game? And what's a world that needs to hear that message? And so if under the income inequality example, maybe your story world is a sci-fi story world like Elysium, where the rich folks live in the sky and the poor folks live on the ground. Or maybe it's a real world story world like India, where billionaires and slumdogs live like 2 blocks apart, right? So it can be, or anywhere on that spectrum, right?
Or Los Angeles.
Or Los Angeles, exactly. And so, but that's the starting point, is what's a world that needs my soapbox or needs my theme? One of my favorite story worlds just in the past couple years is a show called Godless that was on, Steven Soderbergh produced it for Netflix. Great high concept, which was a town, an old west town, where all the men in the town died in a mining accident. And so the only people that are left in the town are the women. And the women sort of run the town, protect the town, do everything in the town. And so, if you listen to the creators talk, the thing that they wanted to say with the show, it's a great show, the thing they wanted to say is that women can be every bit as strong as men. Women can do just as cool, awesome, interesting, cool things as men. That's what they wanted to show. They want to give a vehicle for this message. And so a world that needs to hear that could be a medieval world, it could be a sci-fi world, but they chose the Old West. So the Old West, is all about like the man's man on the horse and the women in the dress that raised the kids at home, and it was very patriarchal in the way society was set up. And everybody looked to the men to do the cool, awesome things, and no one looked to the women to do those things. And so the starting place for that story world is a world that needs that message, which is the Old West, right? And so that basically, once you understand your theme, that kind of puts guardrails on the ideation process of your story world, to where now you just know you need a world that needs your theme, which will necessarily eliminate certain ideas, right? So you don't, if it's in income inequality, you don't want to have your story world be a place where income inequality isn't a problem. It'll eliminate those story world options and then limit you to the ones that do. But ultimately, if you do that, the benefit of this is that it takes your soapbox and your theme and it bakes it into the cake of the story world itself. So that every story that you ever explore within that story world will naturally, intrinsically communicate your message. It will be in the DNA, like woven into the DNA of the story world itself. No matter where we go in Jurassic Park, they never have to tell us that it's a bad idea to have made dinosaurs. We just know it. And we know it because the soapbox of Jurassic Park, which I think is don't play God, because when we try to play God, we screw it up. That is built into the idea itself. It's built into the storyboard itself, and it's always there, right? Which is really interesting. And so the starting point with story world is, what do you want to say? What's your perspective? What's your commentary? And then how do we create a world that needs that? Then what you need to do is you need to layer in, I think, a high concept, which is just a commercially interesting idea, something that is immediately interesting and that can grab people's attention. And I think a lot of people focus on high concept when it comes to story, and people don't focus on how to create a high concept for the world itself. Because the world itself needs to be interesting and commercial, and it needs to grab people's attention just as much as the characters and the story. So a town where all the men died and it's completely run by women, that's a great high concept, right? So the interest isn't on a specific character or a specific storyline. The interest is on the town itself. With Lost, the high concept is an island that travels through time, and all this weird stuff happens. We can take any of those individual characters out of that island. That island is still interesting because that island has a high concept. The Skull Island in the King Kong franchise. There's something about Skull Island that creates giant animals. So I can take King Kong out of Skull Island, and there's still interesting things there. There's the high concept is attached to the world, and so figuring out irony of what's something that surprises you about this world, something that is interesting. Like I think Zootopia is a great example in an animated sense, where this is a world where animals live as civilized humans, right? And that's irony, and that's irony attached to the world itself. Then they were able to take an ironic world and create an ironic story or a high concept story inside the high concept world, where now they had a little tiny bunny that wanted to be a police officer, and all the other police officers were like the giant rhinos and everything. So they had a high concept character, high concept plot, but the world itself was independently high concept, right? And that's what makes the world interesting, and that's what creates the story potential over time. So you have to think about, so a lot of filmmakers will naturally understand a log line. What's a log line for your story? And that's just a really one sentence way to be able to encapsulate your plot and in a way that's interesting and makes people want to read your script. I'm very bullish on creating a log line for your story world, in addition to your individual stories. And so a story world log line goes something like this. A story world is a place where ironic things happen. That's a template I always use for a story world. And if you can just use that template and say the story world is a place where ironic things happen, then you will always have something interesting. So for example, Neverland is the story world. Neverland is a faraway fantasy land where people don't age and live as kids forever. Right? So the story world is a place. What kind of place is it? Is it a city? Is it a country? Is it a galaxy? No, it's a faraway fantasy land. And where's the irony? What's the surprising part of it? What's the interesting part of it? It's a place where you don't age and remain as a kid forever, right? So if you go through your story world and you say, can I make a story world log line out of it that's independently interesting, and by adding in irony and a high concept to the world itself, now you have some commerciality and some interest and something that is that by itself can grab people's attention.
Trey, what about Gilead in The Handmaid's Tale or Sharp Objects? I don't know if you watched that.
Sure.
Sharp Objects.
Yeah.
What about that story world? Can you do?
So I mean, obviously with a Handmaid's Tale, I think the irony, the high concept of that world. One, that's when we're talking about soapbox and what's your message and how to create a story world that needs that message. When it talks about the reproductive rights of women, I think that's very clearly the commentary of the patriarchy controlling the reproductive rights of women. That's a world that needs to hear that message, obviously. And then they layer in the high concept, which is, not every woman can give birth, and there's some women that can give birth that are now controlled and forced to give birth as like these forced surrogates. That's the big commercial idea. But it's the big commercial idea rooted in an important message, right? Which is kind of interesting how those flow together, which gets you to the point of where your story world is now not just cool. The coolness comes through the high concept, but it's also important, and the importance comes through the soapbox. They work together for the whole thing. So I think The Handmaid's Tale is a tremendous story world, tremendously interesting story world. Outside of any individual character, outside of any individual story, someone can tell me the concept of the story world itself, and I'm in. That's interesting, that's cool. And now I want to go check it out. I can see where the story potential is, et cetera, et cetera. I think with Wind Gap in Sharp Objects, I think Wind Gap is a small Midwest town where everybody has a secret. Nothing is as it seems. I mean, just the way they built that world is really interesting. Even with like the teenagers that roller skate around town. That one little addition, they're not riding bikes, they're roller skating, which added this really interesting element to it, right? And so just the way they crafted that world, it wasn't just like any other normal small town. It was a small town with a dark underbelly that was very difficult for anybody to tap into. It had this like weird veneer, but it was just a really interesting world. I think with Stranger Things, right? Hawkins is a small Indiana town that is a portal to another dark mirror dimension, right? One sentence, you understand the high concept, the commerciality of that world, right? I can take Mike and the gang and the Demogorgon and everybody out of Stranger Things, and Hawkins is still interesting because the high concept is attached to the world itself. The problem is a lot of people design films and TV and novels and things like that with the high concept attached to the character, which means if you pull the character out, now the place is no longer interesting, which means you've tied your IP to that specific character, which means you're going to limit your story potential and your story options across platform because the high concepts with him. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, for example, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, right? The high concept there is the fish out of water concept of a West Philly street hustler who's removed from West Philly and now lives in Bel-Air, right? That's the high concept. But if I take Will out of the Fresh Prince, Bel-Air is no longer interesting. It's interesting because he's there, because the high concept lives with him, right? Same thing with Beverly Hills Cop, right? I mean, this is the same thing. And Beverly Hillbillies, the whole thing, right? It's almost like a shared story world of people that aren't supposed to be there that are there, right? But if you take out those characters, now we can't follow. One of my favorite story worlds is The Leftovers. It's an HBO show, 3 seasons, tremendous story world, where 2% of the world's population disappears instantly, and nobody knows where they went. And so you can follow with that high concept, you can follow any character in that world, and the world is still interesting because this is a world where people can just disappear and you don't know why, right? So we buy in and we're interested because of the world. That's where the interest comes. And then if you can tell me a commercial story inside a commercial world, all of a sudden now you're hitting on all levels, right? Because ultimately you have to have a great story inside a high concept world, else your product isn't good. Like one of the, if you remember the movie Jupiter Ascending with Channing Tatum, Mila Kunis, it was the Wachowskis, that, after their masterpiece of The Matrix, they went and created Jupiter Ascending, which I thought was a tremendous story world, but a really, really bad story. And so when you have a great world and a bad story, everything falls apart because your product just simply isn't good. And the same with Tomorrowland with George Clooney. Tomorrowland's awesome, but the movie was bad, so that sort of killed the whole thing. But if you can tell a great story inside a great world, this is when you have IP potential forever because your product is great and the story world is independently interesting, which is going to create more opportunities for you moving forward.
What about the original Blade Runner?
I think the whole world of Blade Runner is really interesting. I think the world itself, is high concept. So with the replicants and are people sort of these robots? Aren't they robots? Or that whole the world is interesting, and especially even in the cinematography, the color, especially the new film Blade Runner 2049. You just see the way they colorize it, and sort of this steampunk dystopian future. The world, I think, without you take Harrison Ford out, still cool. It's just still really interesting. Dune is another great one. You take that's a great story world. And so for fans, you can take the Starks out of Game of Thrones. I think Game of Thrones is still interesting, right? The high concept is with the place. Now I think you can take Wall-E out of Wall-E, and the world is still interesting, right? And so this is just an interesting tactic to judge, does the world have viability in and of itself, right? So you want to have a soapbox that sort of spurs the initial creation. Then you want to layer in the high concept, which builds the interest. Mortal Engines, which the new Peter Jackson movie that's coming out based on the books, I think is a really interesting high concept where this is a dystopian future where cities roll around on wheels, like tank wheels. So London rolls around, and cities move. And I saw the teaser. I've never read the books. I saw the teaser and I said, that's weird. I don't know why cities roll around on wheels in this weird dystopian future, but they do. And now I'm interested because I buy into the story world itself. One thing I think is really interesting that can help filmmakers is really pay attention to what's going on in video games. So the video game industry has made more money last year than movies, television, and music combined. Made $148 billion worldwide. tremendous. So video games are doing something that nobody else is doing in any other industry. And if you pay attention to how the video games are promoting and getting people interested in their IP, you will see that video games, the thing they push most are story worlds. They will get you interested in the story world itself before anything else, before they sell you on mechanics, before they sell you on style, before they sell you on individual story. The high concept is always going to be attached to the story world itself. Whether it's Fallout, whether it's Death Stranding, whether it's Fortnite, where it's a battle, it's a crazy place where people drop out of a school bus into this like ever shrinking world that you can build forts. There's like, whatever it is, the way they sell and the way they get interest is because they're pushing forward story worlds that are independently interesting beyond any one character or one story. And so I think filmmakers can look at that. Now, I don't think you have to have a big budget to have a good high concept story world. Like again, a high concept story world doesn't have to be Star Wars, it doesn't have to be Harry Potter. Like a great high concept story world can exist in $100,000 feature. It doesn't change the way you create an idea. One of my favorite stories about that is The Purge. Purge is a great high concept story world where the Purge is a dystopian America where all crime is legal for 12, 24 hours, whatever it is. And that's a story world logline. It's easily understandable, has irony in the line itself that gets interest into the world. But when you go watch the original Purge movie, it's all set in a house. They don't leave the house. And that's all, you talk to filmmakers and they'll understand any movie that never leaves a house, excuse me, it's because of budget. It's a cost-saving mechanism to only have one location. So they had a very small budget, and so they couldn't go explore this tremendous world that they had created, right? So what I loved about that is really what they didn't do. What they didn't do is say, you know what? We have this really cool idea for a world, but we only have a very small budget to make a movie. So let's just set aside our high concept world and just make a movie about bad guys trying to kill people inside of a house, and we'll save our cool story world concept for later when we have a big budget. What they did, they said, no, we'll create the world, and then we'll execute inside a house because that's all the budget we have. And then if that's successful, then guess what they did in The Purge 2? They went outside the house and began exploring the world. So what happens is even if you have a really high concept story world idea, but a small budget, you can execute in that small budget. But then when you go to create the second story and the third story, you now have a growth plan and room to now grow organically inside that world. Because if they were to come out with the second movie and said, oh yeah, by the way, you can kill people for one day, and they added the high concept the second time around, it would have been inauthentic. And so I'm very, very much an advocate for designing a 40,000 square foot blueprint for a house and this large story world that has independent interest, even if you can only build one room. Because when you build the first room, what happens is if it works and everything goes well, you can go start to build the second room and the third room, and now you have a growth plan where your plumbing connects and your electrical connects and everything like works well as you grow out. And then maybe you get to a bigger room and a bigger room and a bigger room where you can explore more things. So, and if it doesn't work, all you've done is burnt one creative idea and you should have 100 more. And so I think a great story world is independent of budget, but at the same time communicates to the audience that this is interesting beyond just one story. And if an audience recognizes that, guess who also recognizes that? It's a buyer, it's an investor, right? So savvy buyers and savvy investors, they look at certain projects now and they say, that's a great world. Because listen, if you sell something to the studio as an independent writer, you sell something to the studio, you're gonna get rewritten anyway. They're gonna put somebody on it that is sort of a tried and true studio writer that's gonna rewrite your stuff anyway. Right? So our studio, if they identify a script that has a great story world where they know they can get 10 or 12 or 100 stories over the next 10 years across 7 different platforms, the investment they make into that script that has that world is a better investment than the one-off script that's just going to be one really good movie, but doesn't give a consideration to any to a story world aspect to it, right? So the studios, the networks, and the investors, they're looking for market potential and story potential, but your story potential is directly linked to the revenue potential, which is also directly linked to the story world itself. And so you actually position yourself for a better chance of acquisition when you have a story world that shows off the revenue potential and the story potential across platform. Even if you don't come up with all the other stuff, even if you don't say this is the video game and this is the Instagram thing, if you just have a tremendous world and sell the world with the story, savvy buyers will recognize that potential for you. Sometimes they think, well, this guy doesn't even know what he has, right? And so what we see now in the industry, it's really interesting. The past 2 years, what's been going on is that studios have been acquiring story worlds without stories. Like you think you just have to have the independent, like the feature film script with the whole thing? Not necessarily, because there's a lot of short films that have been created that don't have feature concepts, that don't even have stories. All they do is have a story world concept that within a week have caused bidding wars between the studios. The studios want the world. They have overall deals with writers and directors and producers already that they can drop in that world to write any script or develop whatever. What they need is the IP. And so tremendous story is there's an artist, a Scandinavian artist named Simon Stålenhag, and he's a painter. And he creates these paintings that are tremendous. They all have like dystopian sci-fi story world elements. Amazon approaches him and says, "We love the story world you're creating in your painting. We want to make a TV show set in this world." He sold a TV show to Amazon without ever writing a pilot script, without even wanting to, right? Because he just created a tremendous world that Amazon said that has potential and we want to play in that sandbox, right? So making sure you have a commercial idea that is attached to the world itself, that's a tremendous thing. Also thinking beyond individual characters, understanding character groups, and so I think that is a smart tactical way to develop story worlds. You're not thinking about Luke Skywalker, you're thinking about Jedi. You're not thinking about Frodo, you're thinking about the hobbits, right? You're not thinking about Iron Man, you're thinking about superheroes. And because the more characters you have, the more character groups you have, you increase story potential and make your world a better populated place with more interesting people. And I think adding in what I call special sauce to your story world is really important, because a lot of, especially now, it's very difficult to come up with a story world idea that hasn't been done as completely unique. And so what I encourage a lot of people to do is, as they develop their individual story worlds, if they find that their story world is similar to other people's story worlds, that's okay. What they need to do is just go in and add 3 or 4 new rules within the world, a special sauce that differentiates them from the convention. For example, vampire story worlds have been done forever. Stephenie Meyer said, I'm still going to do vampires, even though vampire story worlds have been done forever, but I'm going to change 2 or 3 rules within my vampire story world. I'm going, instead of them being soulless, emotionless beasts, my vampires are going to be super emo lovers. Instead of them melting in the sunlight, they're going to sparkle, right? She changed 2 or 3 rules. All of a sudden, this story world in Twilight feels fresh and new, right? Like wizard stuff has been done forever, but J.K. Rowling made these children wizards and gave it a little fresh twist that just made that story world feel fresh and new. And so find a way just to if you're doing zombies or if you're doing something in space, you're doing something in like sword and sandal fantasy, figure out the 1 or 2 or 3 rules that you can change within that world that just makes it feel different than Star Trek or Game of Thrones or whatever else. And if you add that special sauce, the little tweak to a world that has a commercially interesting idea that's rooted in a thematic, then all of a sudden you are light years ahead of any creator that just is trying to write like the one individual script. You are now on the way to creating a really robust and interesting story world.